Hello, my name is GB Kim. I'm so grateful to be a part of this GNSI conference and pre-recorded hello to everyone. I hope you're enjoying your time. So I identify professionally as an illustrator in the sciences, but personally identify also as a painter generally. And my roots are in sculpture. That was the medium I started in as a child, clay, stone, metal, glass, fabric. And I would include my training in dance, track, tennis, all kinds of sports as well, just because I think that I brought the same mentality to all the practices, and I think that they contribute to um, my practice and mentality today. So I think the other relevant thing to know briefly is that I was born to two scientists, and because I think I was a difficult child to babysit or just for general lack of income, my daycare was both of their lab spaces. So in many ways, I was like physically and mentally immersed in sciences. From infancy. So to get to this point now, I think I would say the most important experience was going to this graduate program, Arts and Politics, hosted at NYU, and the program kind of offered me this deep historical analysis of global colonialism and also an intensive political education for artists, but it also gave me a community of radical artists and mentors that I didn't know I needed. And I also, elected to take elective class at Gallatin, which is the interdisciplinary school there, and it was the history and philosophy of science, medicine, and technology taught by this historian Miles Jackson. And I think the two pieces, this like global colonialism and history education and history of science education together, kind of revealed to me my history and context, and as a whole gave me, with everyone involved, the glue I needed to push all my practices together, and to put it really simply, to make the decision to be an artist in the sciences. Um, and so some of that education, some of these things that I think about is what I thought I would bring today. And so just to jump right in, I titled this presentation Sovereignty Over Sight because from everything I've learned up until this point, I would argue that the goal of the culture of science, right, that generally thought of as the pursuit of knowledge, was and is more like an establishing of knowledge, was and can be about the establishing of knowledge. And so this is an examination that looks at science as a socio-political actor, where the scientific community's rules have the power to police what counts as valid knowledge. And this is a position that arbitrates what objectivity is. And so there's a text called Objectivity, written by Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison, and they refer to something called the epistemic virtues. And epistemology is the study of knowledge, its justification, how it's made, how rational the beliefs are. And so epistemic virtues are the values, practices, character, and beliefs that go into creating, defining, and pursuing knowledge. And so the scientific self is a vessel for whatever epistemic virtues we put in it. And I would add so to the artistic self. And they elect to examine this history through scientific images, because, and images in general, well, scientific images, as they say, the image is the oldest and most ubiquitous practice in service of objectivity. And the image, they quote, encodes a technology of scientific sight, implicating the author, the illustrator, production, and the reader. And so that definition feels very expansive to me, and I like the way that they cover in such detail on how they deal with atlases. And so I thought that, they focus on three epistemic virtues: truth to nature, mechanical objectivity, and trained judgment. And they say themselves, they're not the only ones by any means, and they're not contained in the sense that, mechanical objectivity has qualities that transfer over from truth to nature and so on, and they're just not discrete. They use the three because it helps them to frame what they're doing. But I think for our purposes, the concept of truth to nature is what I think is relevant for natural science illustrators. And it emerges around the 18th century, and as an ideology, it seeks to distill and imagine like a universal truth, a true typus, right? And so a perfect type was regular and uniform, free of any, bug-eaten bits or anything like that. And it was kind of like an icon that was able to demonstrate the divine in nature. And so this is an image expressed in atlases as an averaging of a lot of different examples. And so and because it's made in this averaged way, it's referred to as like a reasoned image, right? And so, even though the essential goal of truth to nature was, of course, to provide, a usable tool, which is what an atlas is. The goal was also to classify and taxonomize the natural world into discrete hierarchies. And so, in many ways, this hierarchy is based on in the Scala Naturae, which is also called the Great Chain of Being. It was developed during the period of medieval Christian scholasticism, which is 1100s to 1700s. And so while we can point to Aristotle's zoological text, the Historia Animalium, which is about 350 BCE, as a critical source and influence for both medieval and Renaissance naturalists, and the anchor for kind of Western systematized biology as we practice it today, the medieval naturalists were still reconciling Christian theology with classical philosophy. And so, to them, it was Pliny the Elder's Natural History, circa, it's like 23 to 79 CE, Common Era, and then physiologists. And so sometimes these texts also involved animals that were, they were called bestiaries, and so they included dragons and things like that. But we can see they're kind of grappling with Christian theology in the Great Chain of Being. So, it's developed with a particular emphasis on divine hierarchy. And so you get God at the top, angels, humans, animals, plants, insects, and earth materials. And so the Great Chain of Being is I bring it up for us because it's a large part of how hierarchy and divine order are concretized into not just truth to nature, but scientific practice generally. And I bring all this up to remind us that, we like to think of science as free from religion and that it's apolitical. But the birth of science really relied on religion and state and vice versa. We see this in kind of the first experiment that we might consider as having established the scientific method, which is Robert Boyle's air pump. And this is detailed in, sorry, excuse me, Leviathan and the Air Pump by Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaefer. So Leviathan refers to Thomas Hobbes, and the air pump is Robert Boyle's machine/experiment. And the point of the exercise is to be able to prove that you can create a vacuum on Earth, and the vacuum is filled with divine ether or divine air. And the reason why you know, being able to prove that divine air can exist on Earth, there is like an invested interest on the part of um, not just the state, but the monarchy, the proof of the divine right to rule. And so, this argument between Boyle and Hobbes is taking place in the mid 1600s, which is the English Civil War over, religious freedom and government, and what kind of government. And so the British monarchy is restored with King Charles II in the spring of 1660. I think it's April 1660. And then the Royal Society, like the Academy for the Sciences, is established in the fall of that same year with King Charles II's blessing. And so, Stephen, Chapin and Schaeffer analyze their analysis that they give is that, the experimental community's way of life was dependent on its ability to invest in the larger political economic climate, which is still true today. And so, you know, in returning to truth to nature, we consider their epistemic virtues, like thinking of this context, like this backdrop that's happening. And so the individuals thought best suited to this task were white European men, Enlightenment naturalists of discerning taste, the reasoned image, right? Men with minds capable of being, the quote is, steeped in but not enslaved to nature as it appeared, from objectivity. And they were, to micromanage artists, engravers, printers. And so truth to nature is utilitarian and idealist, but to the taste of those who practiced it. And so this kind of brings us to this question, like, who kind of decides what qualifies as the natural world, right? Who keeps the gate? And we see, aside from atlases, we can see this in the natural history museums today. The Natural History Museum, they have this air of neutrality. They're official institutions, often backed by government and or private funding. And it's a political underscoring of the Natural History Museum's kind of preciousness and gravity to society. And they're also used to kind of educate children, adults, tourists, like how to see the world, And so when we recall our experiences of natural history museums, they're often, like fossils, taxidermied animals, dioramas, possibly culturally inaccurate dioramas, and especially cultural objects. And so the question is, whose cultural objects? And some of us may be surprised to realize that the natural world just apparently does not refer to white Europeans. And this is like strongly indicative that the natural world has largely been defined and depicted through the eyes of Eurocentrism. And, this makes sense when we think of the precursors to modern museums as being cabinets of curiosities. I don't know if you've heard this term, but they're also called Kunstkammern, cabinet of wonder. Collections of curious otherworldly objects, animals, statues, skins, plants. And so this is like a 1700s era. And, the Great Chain of Being, as I mentioned before, was especially regarded and utilized to enforce like hierarchical schema of man's supremacy. And so, this is the era of European colonialism, and these collections don't just indicate this global movement of naturalists, but the consumption of the world, not only through the theft of curious otherworldly objects, but also the theft of people, and this is slavery. And, in the essay by a lot of this natural history museum information I've gotten from this essay by a mentor of mine, John Kuo Wei Chen, and I will provide all the resources in a different list. And his essay titled "Who is Curating What and Why?" He explains that this contemporary idea of the curator, as one who cares for a collection, as the quote officer in charge of a museum, gallery of art, library, or the like, is deployed as early as 1667 in reference to the curator of the Royal Society. This is 7 years after it's been established. And so, Chen acknowledges that curation is essentially a process of caretaking and storytelling, which is something that we all do. But he's asking, what does the collection and display of things defined widely to include material and digital objects do for any given society? And, he answers this by saying, like, he says, quote, by arranging things from different sites and eras of the British Empire, he's talking about the British Empire, and beyond, the compression of time slash space into an accessible building, encouraging the visitor to imagine a sense of global knowing and commodification. And he also references a person called Thomas Richards, what he called the Imperial Archive, which offers this fantasy of knowledge, fantasy of authority, and it's, quote, the claiming of the world through the acquisition and organization of information. And so this legacy of truth to nature, all the histories kind of surrounding it, the context in which it's born, is still with us now, obviously, as a norm. And it's kind of invisibilized in this way, but because it's problematic because the natural world is always kind of existing exotic to the curator, the viewer. And so this insisting on understanding the world through typification, through troping, flattens what or who is being seen as a form of domination. It's an objectification. And so I think for us modern scientific illustrators, what does this mean? Um, to me, what it means is that we do not exist in a vacuum. Our work comes with an invisibilized and neutralized history. And there's an essay by Donna Haraway called Situated Knowledges, and she speaks about the conquering gaze from nowhere. And she says this is the gaze that mythically inscribes all the marked bodies, that makes the unmarked category claim the power to see and not be seen, to represent while escaping representation. This gaze signifies the unmarked positions of man and white. And so, she provides that the reason why this position is so problematic is because it's, quote, unlocatable, and so makes irresponsible knowledge claims. Irresponsible means unable to call into account. And this is not really, it's not a literal unlocatableness of, I can't find the scientist, but about how neutrality and objectivity, it's about how it might impede our ability to question how knowledge is established, how it's created, and who is doing it, and for what purpose. And so it reminds me of I very much disagree with this. Concept is called death of the artist, and I would extend it into death of the scientist as well. And so death of the artist is about how, that artwork can slash should be viewed out of the context of the artist and their context and their history. And I just do not agree with that. I think that our context changes the meaning of our work, and that it should change the meaning of our work. And that's kind of that locatableness, that accountability. Take Watson and Crick, right? I think made this enormous contribution to genetics, to biology, but they were both very ardent eugenicists, and even Watson, up until very recently, is on record, 2008, I think, saying very anti-black, white supremacist things, and I that to call that a mistake or something that we can correct or erase, I think that knowledge, what it's for, is to understand that it's not that we don't teach what they gave, it's to know that their beliefs were not, I think it's called a bug. It's not a bug of a program, but a feature of a program, right? It's not a quirk of these two men in their era. It is a commonplace belief of the people of their time. And not just the 20th century, but the 18th century, the 17th century, the 16th century, and you know, Linnaeus's piece, I think it's 1735, Systema Naturae. He ranks the races in his work, in the gift of taxonomy that he gave us, but we don't speak about that. And I think that um, it to know these things helps us both to have the information and to understand the power field in which it was made and the dynamic in which it was made. And so, even in the work that I do at XBio, this is an unresolved thing that we will still continue to work on. That there is not a lot of reason for us to speak about gender necessarily, but there are places where we talk about sex and reproduction, talk about zygotes, we talk about inherited traits. And so to use the term male and female is not necessarily true to the spectrum of sex. And there is we still have yet to come up with the terminology, how to both be clear, provide information, do these things. But I hope that our team and our work can be accountable to things like that, and that I want us to be able to make the mistake, have that on record, and then make changes to that. And I think, in that vein, when I think about the futurism, the science fiction, when I was initially approached to speak at this conference, I think one of the interests was to hear about something I think I'd written in a biography somewhere, that a profile that said that I think a lot about science fictions as very productive spaces. And so what I mean by that is there are things that science fiction as a genre, as a trope, as a stereotype, like, all bring up for us, right? I think in contemporary times it might be space travel related, right? But to me, I include that as well, but I think of, art is already this like fictive space. When we bring things into existence that haven't existed before, that feels like a rendering of future, and or fiction at the very least, right? And um, as people who work in the sciences, we are operators of a kind of science fiction. And I think in that futurism, things I try to hold in my mind are, is it possible that there's an importance to giving representation to humane medical and technological futures? And I wish there was a better word than humane that did not just indicate people. Um, and, dystopias, I I love and am entertained by. They're very dramatic, and I appreciate them for different things. But I think that I think a lot about what it is for us to be able to visualize and see and make real non-dystopian futures, better outcomes. And, as I was kind of mentioning about a non-human definition, can we be accountable by decentering humans? I think a really dangerous position to think from is anthropocentric views, anthropocentrism, that this operating mode that centers human existence. And I think part of being accountable, locatable, situated in my knowledge is acknowledging that humans are not supreme nor centric to the world. And this was the problem. This is the problem with something like the Scala Naturae, like hierarchical methods of taxonomy, this consumption and organizing of the world into a divine order. How can we teach each other to value beyond human existence? And then just practically, reducing harm. um, One really critical thing is I think that we should not think of our work as simplifying information for the masses. This condescension is, I feel, another means of maintaining the barrier between sciences and the people abstractly. Scientists and their translators have an obligation to speak about their studies clearly and to not think of that clarity as something less than, that the two languages have equal weight. And it's a difficult ask to make because I think a lot of times we are deep in our knowledge and not wide in our knowledge. And so when we are specialized in that way, it can be very difficult. I understand when people go through several years of PhD training to know how to do this thing and be able to speak to their peers. Obviously, there's going to be this like language lockup. But, I think that kind of brings me to the next thing about reducing harm is to operate the most interdisciplinary way that one can, like having people in your community that don't do the things that you do. And I think that, that helps me to understand how to be curious without entitlement to a knowledge, how to be curious without objectifying. And I think that what else is that we can recognize that scientific, technological, engineering, mathematical knowledges are true. Like all the marches that were happening in 2017, like science is real. Yes, like they're valid things. Like climate change is real, and that these knowledges come to us from imbalanced, that a lot of things are built inside an imbalance of structure. And I think that one of the practical ways to look at it is, tech companies they built their own AI watchdog teams and then fired them when they didn't get the responses that they wanted, right? So that the ethics of operation, of factual knowledge, of establishing knowledge, to recognize always that like science is real and that we all come to the table without knowledge, and that information comes to us sometimes without its context. And so, I think to conclude, the person I was speaking about before, John Kuo Wei Chen, who did the essay, who was curating What and Why, he proposed that curation could be a radical practice that disrupts and implodes oppressive dynamics. And I think, you know, in if if people were to ask me, what it is that I do, and I, for some reason, didn't intend on giving a very clear answer or something, I would say that I was a translator. I think in the essential form of what I do, and what we do, is translation, and to translate is to curate. Um, and so thinking about that, thinking about what Jack Chen is saying, it feels possible for us to change how we see existence, for better or worse. It's a double-edged blade, that this understanding, right, that like the image has, it, it is neither, that it has impact, that it has power, that it is possible for us to change a world because we've already done it, that it's already been happening, that we've already been curating the world. And so, and I guess like one last thing, to plug for scientific illustrators, to know your worth and ask for what you deserve. um, I think that scientists should or any institution should recognize the value of creative people. So yeah, um, I hope that this is informative in some way. I hope that there are things that you can take away. Uh, Please enjoy the rest of your time at this conference, and thank you so much for having me. Bye.